Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. It all began on a normal day. The sun shone down, birds chirped in the air, and people went about their routines as they always did. The hum of the city was alive with the usual noise, children heading to school, workers rushing to their jobs, and the elderly chatting away on park benches. Everything was just as it had always been, until the sky itself tore open. No one saw it coming. One second the sky was clear, and the next, a massive rift split across the heavens. From that rift, ships emerged, dark, towering, and unnatural. They moved with an eerie hum, a sound that seemed to echo through the very bones of anyone who heard it. At first it was dismissed as some kind of freak atmospheric event. Maybe a satellite had fallen or some strange experiment had gone wrong. But when a city, just one, suddenly vanished, wiped off the map without a trace, it became clear. This wasn't an accident. This was a war. No one had any time to prepare. The ships didn't land and negotiate. They didn't demand anything. They simply unleashed destruction. New York, Paris, London, gone in an instant. Whole cities were wiped from existence, reduced to nothing more than dust and ashes. The world watched in horror, helpless as governments fired missiles, launched jets, and even tried to use nuclear weapons. But it was pointless. The enemy's technology was far beyond anything humanity had. Every missile was destroyed in mid-air. Every jet burned before it even got close. The feeling of powerlessness was overwhelming. It wasn't just the fear of death. It was the realization that no matter what humanity did, it was no match for these invaders. It felt as though we were insects trying to take on something far beyond us, and that something didn't even see us as worth the effort. But the invaders made one fatal mistake. They underestimated us. Even as the world seemed to lose hope, even as the smoke from destroyed cities darkened the skies, there was something the invaders didn't understand about humanity. We don't quit. Not when it matters. And especially not when we have nowhere left to run. The invaders, unaware of the small, seemingly insignificant town in Montana, turned their attention next to a place no one had heard of. No strategic value, no military importance, just an out-of-the-way town. What they didn't know was that in that town lived Marcus Lane, a retired military engineer who had spent decades designing weapons too dangerous to ever be used. When the invasion came, Marcus didn't run or hide. He went straight to his basement, where he had kept the remnants of his old projects. Wild, dangerous weapons that had been buried for years. For 3 days, he worked non-stop. The world was falling apart around him, but Marcus didn't stop. He built something out of nothing but old parts, theories, and his raw desperation. The end result was a machine that looked like nothing more than a junkyard project. An old, rusted satellite dish welded onto a weathered pickup truck. But to Marcus, it was humanity's last hope. When it was ready, he didn't hesitate. He aimed the machine at the nearest alien ship hovering above, turned it on, and fired. The ship didn't explode. It didn't crash. It vanished completely. One moment it was there, looming in the sky, and the next, it was gone. No smoke, no debris, just empty air. The rest of the alien fleet froze. For the first time, they hesitated. Marcus wasted no time. He grabbed an old radio, hooked it up to the machine, and sent a message through the invaders' communication system. His voice was shaky but clear. Earth to the invaders, attack again and face total annihilation. Silence followed. The world waited, holding its breath. Then, like a tide pulling back, the ships turned and retreated, vanishing into the hole they'd torn in the sky. The tear sealed behind them, leaving nothing but the quiet of the clear blue sky. The war was far from over. But for the first time, there was hope. Because humanity had sent a message. And this time, they meant it. The world had never been the same since that day. It wasn't just the fear or the loss that had changed things. It was the awareness, the understanding that Earth had stepped into something far beyond anything it had ever known. For the first time, humanity had faced an enemy so powerful, so far beyond their reach, that it seemed almost laughable to think they could survive. But Marcus Lane had proven them wrong. When the invaders retreated, the world stood still. There was no immediate celebration, no parades, no chants of victory. The human race was too battered, too broken to embrace the idea of triumph. The cities still smoldered, the bodies still piled up, and the streets were littered with the wreckage of an attack humanity hadn't even been able to understand fully. The relief that came with the invaders' retreat was tempered by the brutal reality that the world had just faced a glimpse of extinction, and that threat was still very much out there. News networks scrambled to make sense of what had just happened, but the story didn't fit into any neat little box. No one knew how Marcus's machine had worked, or why it had worked, for that matter. Governments rushed to seize Marcus and his invention, desperate to reverse-engineer the device that had temporarily turned the tide. The UN was the first to act, sending a team of soldiers and scientists to Marcus's small town, the scene of his greatest triumph and, perhaps, his greatest mistake. Marcus wasn't interested in their questions or their demands. He had saved the world once, but that was a small victory compared to what was coming. He knew it wouldn't be long before the invaders came back, smarter, more determined, and angrier, and when they did, Earth would need more than just one rusty satellite dish bolted onto a truck. It would need unity, strength, and weapons far beyond anything humanity had ever built. But that wasn't the way the world was right now. World governments, despite the devastation, were still divided. There were no immediate calls for global unity or cooperation. The scramble for resources had already begun. Power and control were still the driving forces of the world. People were still trying to figure out how to rebuild, how to carry on with their lives, how to recover from the trauma. For many, the idea of another attack, let alone a full-scale war, was so far beyond comprehension that it was easier to ignore it. Governments wanted the technology, but they wanted it for themselves. They wanted to be the ones in control of the next stage of humanity's defense. Marcus had lived through enough politics in his lifetime to know what would happen next. As soon as the first helicopters arrived, he knew it wasn't about gratitude or help. It was about power. The leaders of the world wanted to control the weapon he had created, to keep it under their control. They came with demands, with threats, and with paperwork. But Marcus Lane wasn't like the others. He wasn't going to bow down to the system that had failed him and the world. He sat on the porch of his run-down house, a shotgun across his lap, and he stared down at the men who had come for him. Their uniforms were clean, their guns polished, but they were nothing more than a reminder of the world's hypocrisy. Marcus had stared down the end of the world. What were a few government agents compared to that? For 2 days, they argued, they tried everything: flattery, bribery, threats, intimidation. Some of them even suggested that accidents happened when people didn't cooperate. But Marcus wasn't scared. He'd seen the face of death and defied it. He wasn't about to let these men think they could control him. The last time the world needed someone to save them, Marcus had stepped up. Now, when they needed him again, he wasn't going to let them use him as a pawn in their political game. When the world's powers realized they weren't going to get what they wanted from Marcus, they decided to take matters into their own hands. They launched a covert operation to remove him, to seize his weapon, to silence him before he could do any more damage. But they underestimated him once again. That night, As black helicopters hovered over the town, masked soldiers swarmed the streets, expecting a quiet capture, a neat and easy operation. But the town had changed since the invasion. The people there weren't going to let their hero be taken. They had seen their homes, their families, their lives destroyed by the invaders. And now they weren't going to let anyone, not even their own governments, take what they had left. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for control of their own future. As the first soldiers landed, they were met with resistance, not just from a few people, but from the whole town. The people who had survived the attack now fought like wolves, cornered and desperate, using whatever they had. Guns, Molotov cocktails, even old farm tools. The streets became a battleground. It wasn't a fight with rules. It wasn't a war fought with honor or pride. It was guerrilla warfare, chaotic, unpredictable, and merciless. The soldiers were trained for combat, but they weren't prepared for the fury of the town that had been left to burn. By the time the operation failed, by the time the government soldiers retreated, they weren't just defeated. They were humiliated. They had underestimated the people of Marcus's town, and they had paid the price. The world had watched it all unfold. The fight was captured on shaky cell phones, uploaded to the internet before the networks could bury the truth. Marcus Lane, the man who had saved Earth from an alien invasion, had become a symbol of defiance, of rebellion, and of the human spirit. And the world was forced to reckon with it. The powers that be had expected Marcus to fall in line, to hand over the weapon, to allow them to control the technology. But he hadn't. And now the world was watching. They saw a man who had stood against the alien invaders, who had beaten them with nothing more than his own ingenuity and sheer willpower. They saw a man who wasn't willing to give up his future, or the future of humanity, just because the world's governments demanded it. And somewhere beyond the stars, the invaders were watching too. They had seen the human resistance rise up against them. They had seen what Marcus Lane had done, and they knew they had made a mistake. Earth wasn't just another weak planet to conquer. Earth wasn't just going to fall into line. Earth had fought back. And that, more than anything, was something the invaders could not ignore. They sent their message, not a warning, but a declaration. We will return stronger. You will pay for your defiance. And Marcus Lane knew that the real battle was just beginning. The stage was set. Humanity had won the first round, but it was clear that the invaders were far from finished. They had been humiliated, and they would return, angrier and more determined than ever. The world had survived, but the war was far from over. Marcus had no illusions about the future. He knew that Earth had to be ready, not just for survival, but for victory. And that meant everything had to change. He couldn't do it alone. No one could. The world was going to have to unite, to come together in ways it never had before. The fight for Earth's survival had only just begun. The question was, would humanity be ready? The tension in the air was thick. Humanity had faced the unimaginable, survived against all odds, and now the question lingered. What would they do with their newfound hope? Marcus knew it wasn't enough just to fight. He had seen what happened when the world's governments scrambled for control. There was no unity, no shared purpose. They had nearly been destroyed once because of their division, and there was no guarantee they would be any more united the next time the invaders returned. The world had only one chance to prepare for what was coming, and Marcus, though weary, was ready to lead once more. But this time, it wouldn't be a lone effort. This time, the world would have to rise together. Marcus's little town in Montana, once forgotten by most of the world, was now ground zero for humanity's defense. The people who had fought back against the soldiers sent to confiscate Marcus's device weren't just any ordinary townfolk. They had become soldiers in their own right. They had learned to fight with what they had, and they had the spirit to take on anything. It was in this town that Marcus found his first allies. These were the people who knew how to survive, who were willing to defend their homes, their families, and their planet with everything they had. They had tasted the bitterness of invasion, and now they knew what it meant to be a warrior in this new world. But despite the bravery and resolve of his town, Marcus knew they couldn't do it alone. The fight had to spread across the globe. The stakes were too high, the odds too overwhelming for any one group to handle. Humanity would have to unite or face complete annihilation. The first thing Marcus did was send out a message, a call to arms. He didn't have the resources to organize a global force, but he had the power of the idea. Humanity had to understand that their survival depended on more than just rebuilding what was lost. They had to change the way they thought. They had to understand that the fight for Earth wasn't over. It was just beginning. The message went out through every channel available: radio, internet, satellite, anything that could carry a signal. Marcus called on humanity to unite, to lay down their differences, and to stand together against the coming threat. His voice, broadcast across the globe, was raw, urgent, filled with a kind of resolve that could only come from someone who had already stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. "This isn't just about survival anymore," Marcus said, his voice shaking with emotion. "This is about proving that we belong here, that we are more than just another planet for them to conquer. We are Earth, and we will fight." As his words echoed through the airwaves, something remarkable happened. It wasn't a miracle, not yet, but it was the first spark of hope. Leaders, generals, and everyday people alike began to listen. The world governments, despite their fractured nature, began to come together. They had no choice. Marcus's message had pierced through the noise, and for the first time since the invasion, there was a sense that the world could be united in purpose. Nations that had been at odds with each other began to shift. They knew they couldn't afford to fight amongst themselves when a far greater enemy was approaching. The United Nations formed an emergency council to lead humanity's defense. Marcus was invited to brief the council, though he wasn't sure how much help his presence would provide. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a man who had built a weapon and used it to save the world, not a man who could broker peace. But despite his reluctance, he agreed to go. The fight for Earth would need more than just physical strength. It would need mental toughness, strategic thinking, and the ability to put aside past grudges for the sake of survival. At the UN headquarters, Marcus stood before the world's leaders, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. He wasn't there to impress them. He was there to prepare them. He had seen what the invaders were capable of, and he knew they would be back, stronger, smarter, more dangerous. There was no time for small talk. There was no room for pride or egos. "I know this isn't what any of you expected," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his eyes sharp with the urgency of the moment. "But you all know the truth now. The world has seen what happens when we are divided. We were lucky to survive the first attack. But luck doesn't last forever. We need a plan. We need weapons. We need unity." The room was silent. For the first time, it seemed like the leaders of the world were listening, really listening. The room was filled with the sounds of papers shuffling and phones buzzing, as representatives from all corners of the globe began to whisper amongst themselves. It wasn't just the military leaders who were now invested in the cause. Scientists, engineers, economists, all of them had realized that they had to put their specialties to work. This was no longer just a war between military forces. It was a war for the survival of every single person on the planet. In the days that followed, a global network of researchers, engineers, and soldiers was formed. Task forces were set up across the globe, each dedicated to improving upon Marcus's device, figuring out how it worked, and most importantly, how to use it against a much larger alien fleet. But as the teams began their work, it quickly became clear. Marcus's invention was no miracle. It wasn't some piece of advanced alien technology that could single-handedly save humanity. It was a temporary solution, a stopgap. The real battle would come when the invaders returned with far more advanced technology and a far more refined strategy. Meanwhile, the world began to change. Cities were rebuilt, though it wasn't the same. The people who walked through the streets had seen their homes and families destroyed. They had tasted fear like never before, and they would never be the same. Every night, people spoke of the future, of what the world would look like after the second invasion. And in those conversations, there was an unspoken truth that no one could deny. Humanity had to be ready. But no one knew exactly how. Marcus returned to his small town, staying out of the media spotlight. He knew what was coming, and he wasn't interested in fame. He had a job to do. His town was preparing for the inevitable, training, strategizing, and readying themselves for a war that would shape the future of the planet. He had already made plans to mobilize the town, to turn it into a fortified base of operations. Every person, from the youngest to the oldest, had a role to play. It was going to take everyone to stand a chance. As the weeks passed, Marcus watched the sky. The warning had come. The invaders had promised they would return, and they had no reason to lie. The ships that had disappeared into the rift would come back, and they would come with a vengeance. But in the time between, Marcus could sense a shift. People were no longer afraid. They weren't paralyzed by the thought of what might happen. They were preparing. They were gearing up for a battle that no one had ever fought before, a battle that would determine not just Earth's future, but the future of humanity itself. And so the preparation continued. While the rest of the world rebuilt and regrouped, Marcus made sure his town was ready, not just for survival, but for the fight of their lives. The invaders might be coming, but Earth wasn't going down without a fight. The stage was now set. The world had its plan. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was immense. But Marcus wasn't about to let humanity falter. The countdown had begun. The countdown was on, and for the first time since the invasion began, the world felt a sense of collective purpose. Every corner of the Earth had been touched by the alien threat, and while humanity had been left in disarray, something remarkable was unfolding in the shadows of the devastation. The global response to the invaders' return had taken shape, and a unified resistance was beginning to form. But for all the progress being made in the halls of governments and underground bunkers, there was still a gnawing sense of unease.
The invaders would be back. It wasn't a question of if, but when. Marcus Lane knew this better than anyone. It was the one certainty he held. He had spent countless nights pacing the floor of his small, battered house, planning, thinking, wondering if humanity could truly stand up to what was coming. It was easy to tell the world that they had survived once and could do it again. It was a different story when the reality of the next invasion was right around the corner. His small town, now a crucial part of the Earth's last line of defense, had become a beehive of activity. People from all over the world, engineers, soldiers, doctors, and scientists, began to pour in. No one had seen the weapon that Marcus had built, but word had spread like wildfire. It was humanity's key to surviving what was coming, and they would stop at nothing to replicate it. But Marcus was cautious. He didn't trust easily. After all, it wasn't just the invaders that posed a threat. It was the forces within humanity that were equally dangerous. He had already witnessed how the world's governments had acted when they thought they were in control. The same power-hungry politicians who once scoffed at the idea of global unity now saw the alien threat as an opportunity, a chance to secure their own power, to bend the world to their will. But Marcus had seen the result of unchecked power before. He couldn't allow the weapon, or the knowledge of how to use it, to fall into the wrong hands. The fate of the Earth depended on a careful balance of trust, responsibility, and unity. The first signs that the invaders were returning appeared in the sky several weeks after the emergency meetings had begun. It started with a ripple in the atmosphere, small at first, but growing larger every day. The satellite images showed rifts opening in the sky, as if the fabric of space itself was being torn apart. The clouds swirled in unnatural patterns, dark and ominous, with flashes of bright, flickering lights that weren't from storms. And then one evening, it happened. The first ship appeared. It didn't come through the rift like before. It just materialized. A massive shadow fell over the land as the ship descended, its form too large to comprehend. A cold chill ran through Marcus as he watched it from his porch, the sky blackened with the silhouette of the alien vessel. But this was only the beginning. Across the globe, people were already preparing. Military forces that had been scattered and fragmented now began to unite under the banner of survival. But as the invaders' fleet began to pour through the rifts, they didn't come alone. The ships were larger, faster, and more advanced than anything humanity had seen. The invasion force was vast, stretching across the horizon like a blanket of death, with hundreds, thousands of vessels descending on Earth. The weapons that Marcus had helped develop were barely enough to fend off the first wave. As the ships began to deploy their forces, humanity's resistance, while brave, was far from prepared for the scale of the enemy's might. The invaders unleashed a new kind of weapon, a bioengineered swarm of monstrous creatures, each one designed to tear through human defenses with terrifying speed. These creatures were unlike anything anyone had ever seen, serpentine, with teeth and claws that could shred through steel like it was paper. They fell from the ships, swarming the cities below, spreading destruction in their wake. And the worst part? These creatures weren't just beasts. They were intelligent. They adapted quickly, learning from every attack, evolving as they went. No matter how much firepower the resistance threw at them, it didn't seem to make a dent. Earth was already losing ground even before the real fight had begun. The news reports were grim. No one knew how to stop the creatures. The first battles were pure chaos. Entire cities fell in a matter of hours, overrun by the alien beasts. Marcus knew the world's defenses couldn't hold for long. The electromagnetic cannons that had been designed from his original device weren't enough. The weapons were powerful, yes, but the invaders had prepared for this. They had studied the human response. They knew what they were up against, and they had adapted. In his town, Marcus and the remaining resistance forces were already at the forefront of the fight, working tirelessly to develop new strategies. While the global leaders and military forces struggled to coordinate a response, Marcus had taken charge of a small, specialized team. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they couldn't afford to wait for the governments to make their next move. The technology needed to be refined. They needed to find a way to break through the aliens' advanced shields, to stop the monstrous creatures, and most importantly, to strike back before Earth was completely overrun. For weeks, Marcus and his team worked around the clock. They scoured the remains of the alien ships that had been destroyed in the first attack, studying the technology, looking for weaknesses. They couldn't figure out how the invaders' shields worked, but they knew they had to find a way to bypass them. Every attempt to reverse engineer their tech had failed. The invaders' weapons were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. Nothing on Earth was designed to counter them. And then, just as Marcus thought they were running out of options, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough came from a scientist who had been working in the background, someone no one had expected to make any significant contributions. Dr. Helena Moore, a brilliant engineer from Germany, had discovered something hidden deep in the wreckage of an alien ship. A small, unassuming piece of technology that, when analyzed, seemed to hold the key to unlocking the alien shield system. It was a component, one that looked almost like a simple circuit board, but its functionality was unlike anything humanity had seen. With the help of the best minds Earth had to offer, Marcus and his team worked around the clock to decipher the technology. They had to move quickly. The invaders weren't just sitting back and waiting. They were expanding, advancing their attacks, and soon they would have enough forces to wipe out any remaining pockets of resistance. As the days stretched on, a plan began to take shape. It was risky, dangerous, and unlikely to work. But it was their only chance. Humanity's resistance had to act fast, before the invaders could regroup, before they could send out reinforcements. Marcus knew the world's future rested in their hands, but as he looked at the people around him, scientists, engineers, soldiers, and civilians, he knew they were ready. They had been through hell, and now they had a chance to fight back. They couldn't afford to fail. And then, the unimaginable happened. From above, a massive fleet appeared, larger than anything humanity had ever seen. It wasn't just a few ships, it was the entire invasion force, gathered for a final assault. The Earth's resistance was about to face its biggest battle yet. The tension was unbearable. The moment had arrived. The fight for humanity's survival would determine everything. Would Marcus and the Resistance be able to use the alien technology to overcome the invaders' overwhelming might? Or would the invaders finish what they had started and erase humanity from existence? The world was waiting, holding its breath, knowing that the fate of Earth rested in the hands of a few brave souls willing to face the unknown. The massive fleet of alien ships loomed above, their dark silhouettes blotting out the sun. They appeared like a storm descending from the heavens, a wave of death and destruction that had been anticipated for months. The invaders' strategy was clear now. They were coming not just to subdue Earth, but to break its will, to wipe out every last trace of resistance and render the planet helpless, forever. But Marcus Lane, despite the overwhelming odds, refused to bow. He stood at the heart of the resistance, with his town now turned into a fortress. His mind raced as he stared at the sight in the sky, his fingers tapping anxiously against the wooden porch railing. The countdown was over. Earth had only hours before the alien ships began their full-scale assault. Time had run out, and humanity's fate was now sealed. "Gather the forces," Marcus ordered, his voice low but firm. The calmness with which he spoke belied the storm raging inside him. He had witnessed Earth's destruction once before. He wasn't going to let it happen again.
In the makeshift command center deep within the town's heart, the resistance was ready. Hundreds of soldiers, civilians, scientists, and engineers had come together, united under one banner: Earth's survival. Everyone had a role to play. Every person understood that this wasn't just another battle. This was the final stand, the last chance humanity had to defend its place in the universe. The tension was palpable as Marcus and his team briefed their forces on the plan. It was risky beyond belief. They had one shot to stop the invaders' invasion fleet from reaching Earth's surface. The small group of engineers, including Dr. Helena Moore, had cracked the alien technology. After weeks of sleepless nights and desperate experimentation, they had discovered a critical vulnerability in the invaders' shield systems. The component they had found, which initially seemed like nothing more than a simple circuit board, had actually been the heart of their defensive technology. Once they had reversed engineered the alien tech, they realized they had a way to disrupt the shields, but it would require perfect precision. They couldn't afford even a small mistake. The electromagnetic cannons, upgraded with the new technology, would be their only hope. But their power needed to be directed precisely to breach the alien ship's protective layers. In the heart of the bunker, Marcus stood with his team, surveying the final battle plans. His mind was sharp, but his body was weary. The fight had taken a toll on him, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He hadn't slept properly in days, haunted by the faces of those who had died during the first wave. His thoughts drifted to the people in his town, the families who had come together in the face of total annihilation. They had all lived through hell, and now they were being asked to walk through it again. "We're ready," Marcus said, though his voice didn't entirely carry the confidence it once had. He wasn't sure if it was doubt or exhaustion creeping into his tone, but he pushed it aside. He had to. The world was watching. The future of Earth depended on them succeeding. The world's remaining military forces had gathered at the front lines, with the electromagnetic cannons positioned in strategic locations. The plan was simple. As soon as the invaders made their move and descended into Earth's atmosphere, the resistance would unleash everything they had. The electromagnetic cannons would focus on disabling the alien ship's shields. Once that was done, the ground forces would strike, using the plasma rifles, newly modified by Marcus's team, to take out the alien soldiers. And if things went according to plan, the final push would come from the sky. The last remnants of Earth's air forces, piloted by the most skilled pilots left, would launch an all-out attack on the alien fleet. But it was a fragile plan. The invaders had thousands of ships. Their technology was beyond anything Earth had. And even if the electromagnetic cannons worked, it wasn't guaranteed they would be able to disable every ship's shields. The overwhelming force of the alien army could wipe out humanity in minutes. "Marcus," Dr. Moore interrupted his thoughts, her voice trembling slightly. "We've done everything we can, but we don't know if this will work. I'm just saying it outright. There are too many variables." Marcus looked at her for a moment, his eyes hard. He didn't need any more doubts. He had too many of his own. But now wasn't the time to falter. "I understand, Helena. But if we don't try, we're already lost. If you're in, I'm in. All of us are." Helena nodded, but Marcus could see the worry in her eyes. There was nothing anyone could do to prepare for the reality of what they were facing. They could only act and hope that the odds would shift in their favor. As the final preparations were made, the world seemed to hold its breath. People across the globe knew what was happening. The alien ships were closing in, their approach becoming more and more visible each day. The world's military forces had already been mobilized, but many knew that this wouldn't be a conventional war. The invaders were not just here to conquer. They were here to destroy. And if Earth couldn't strike back with everything it had, the planet might never see another sunrise. Marcus sat for a moment, staring out into the distance, watching the horizon darken with the approaching ships. The wind had picked up, swirling dust through the empty streets. He could almost feel the weight of the moment, the history unfolding around him. He thought about the families that would be torn apart, the lives lost in this battle. But then he thought of the message he had sent to the invaders, the one that had been broadcast across the stars. Attack again and face total annihilation. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. The world had survived the first wave, and it had fought back. The invaders had underestimated humanity once, but now they would see what Earth was capable of. He had to believe that. "Marcus?" General Teague's voice broke through the silence. The general had been one of the few leaders who had stood by Marcus from the beginning. He knew the stakes as well as anyone. "It's time." Marcus nodded, his expression hardening. "Let's do this." The sun was setting as the last preparations were completed. In the distance, the alien ships began to take shape, their monstrous forms appearing in the twilight sky. The resistance forces had been deployed, and Marcus could hear the hum of engines and the sound of footsteps as the final waves of soldiers took their positions. He stood at the front, just outside his house, staring up at the sky. The cold, distant ships reminded him of the first invasion, of the destruction they had brought with them. But this time, it would be different. Marcus took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The first alien ship pierced through the clouds, followed by another, then a third. And soon, the sky was filled with them. But Earth wasn't going to wait for the battle to come to them this time. "We strike first," Marcus said. And in that moment, the world took a collective breath, preparing to face the greatest enemy humanity had ever known. The first shots rang out. The first shots fired were deafening. They cracked the silence of the night like thunder, shaking the ground beneath Marcus's feet. The electromagnetic cannons hummed to life, their energy crackling in the air, a harsh reminder of the firepower Earth had managed to marshal in its desperate fight for survival. The alien ships, still descending in their eerie, unstoppable formation, suddenly shuddered under the weight of the barrage. One by one, they began to flicker, their protective shields glitching, then faltering, and in some places, completely collapsing. The Resistance had planned for this. They had spent weeks refining the electromagnetic pulse weapons, tweaking their systems, testing them until they were sure that they could disable the alien shields. Now it was working. The ships above began to lose their invisibility, their once impenetrable defenses breaking down. But the moment the shields dropped, the air crackled with tension. This was the opening humanity needed, and they had to take full advantage of it. From the ground, soldiers fired everything they had, launching plasma bolts and explosive charges toward the enemy ships. The air was filled with the hum of weapons charging, the thunderous roar of artillery, and the screams of fighters soaring through the sky. The Resistance had mobilized every scrap of military equipment they could find, from jets to makeshift drones, to fight back. But humanity was outclassed in almost every way. The alien ships were enormous, each one capable of wiping out entire cities with a single blast. Their technology was advanced far beyond what Earth could even dream of matching. Despite the temporary success of their electromagnetic weaponry, the true scale of the threat was now becoming painfully clear. Above, the alien ships began to retaliate. Their weapons, strange, alien, and terrifying, fired in quick succession, sending bright beams of destructive energy down toward Earth's surface. When one of those beams struck the ground, entire buildings disintegrated into nothing but ash. The ground quaked with the force of the impact, and the sky lit up with violent flashes of red and orange. The battlefield below was chaos, and it seemed like the alien forces were everywhere at once, releasing swarms of bioengineered creatures and deploying their soldiers with frightening efficiency. Marcus stood at the front, directing his team. He watched as soldiers scrambled to hold their positions, their faces painted with the grit of survival. It wasn't just the military forces this time. Ordinary citizens, men and women from all walks of life, had been pressed into service. Farmers, engineers, doctors, anyone who could wield a weapon or fight in some way had been drafted, and now they were all standing side by side, fighting for their homes, their families, and the future of the planet. In the midst of the violence, Marcus could hear the crackle of the communication system as orders were shouted over the radio. His voice remained steady, though it felt like his heart was about to explode in his chest. "Focus fire on the command ship. The moment we take it down, the rest will fall," he barked into the comms, his eyes scanning the sky. The command ship, the largest and most intimidating of the alien vessels, floated above the battlefield like a dark god, emitting waves of energy that seemed to distort the air around it. The invaders had made it clear. This ship was their command center, and if humanity could somehow disable it, the rest of the invasion force would be left vulnerable. The key was to get close enough, to hit it with everything they had, while the electromagnetic weapons still held. As the Resistance continued their assault, Marcus's mind was spinning with calculations. The electromagnetic pulses had weakened the alien ships, but the damage was far from enough. It had been a temporary fix, a brief moment of advantage. The invaders had adapted quickly, and Marcus could see that they were already deploying their countermeasures. Small, drone-like fighters launched from the belly of their ships, darting toward the ground with terrifying speed. Each one was equipped with devastating weaponry, capable of tearing through Earth's defenses like a hot knife through butter. Marcus's eyes narrowed. It was now or never. "Activate the secondary cannons," he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. The secondary cannons were the last line of defense, the final offensive weapon they had. It wasn't enough to fight back on their own. They needed an extra push, an element of surprise, something to keep the invaders from overwhelming them completely. The resistance fighters who had manned the secondary cannons unleashed their firepower with a thunderous roar, and Marcus watched, breathless, as one of the alien fighters exploded in a ball of fire above them. A cheer erupted from the ground forces, but Marcus didn't allow himself to be distracted. This was only a small victory. The war was far from over, and they had much more to overcome. Suddenly, a warning light flashed on the control panel in front of him. The familiar, foreboding beeping filled the air, and Marcus's stomach dropped. "What's happening?" he barked, turning toward Dr. Moore, who was manning the technology station. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with tension. "The alien fleet. They're sending reinforcements, and they're deploying something bigger." A shiver ran down Marcus's spine as he watched the new ships emerge from the rift in the sky. These were not like the others. Larger, faster, and heavily armored, they were designed to withstand the very attacks humanity had been using. The invaders had come prepared this time. The reinforcements dropped into the atmosphere with a brutal efficiency, and soon they were spreading across the ground, deploying squads of their terrifying bioengineered creatures. The battlefield had grown even more chaotic. The resistance fighters, though determined, were outnumbered, and now they were facing enemies they weren't ready for. These new invaders didn't just have strength. They had the element of surprise on their side. Each new ship that landed sent a new wave of destruction onto the Earth's surface, and the humans couldn't keep up. Marcus's mind raced. He had to think fast. There was no time left for hesitation. They had a limited window to break through the alien command center's defenses. They needed something that would buy them time, something that would hold off the reinforcements long enough for the electromagnetic cannons to recharge and launch one more devastating blast. The plan was risky, and Marcus knew it. The secondary cannons were nearly exhausted, and the remaining resistance forces were growing more desperate by the minute. The invaders were relentless, and with each passing moment it seemed like the battle was slipping further from humanity's grasp. But Marcus wasn't willing to let Earth fall into their hands. He took a deep breath, willing himself to think clearly. Then he turned to General Teague, who had been standing by his side throughout the chaos. "We need to take out that command ship. Now," Marcus said. "Deploy the last of the air support. We need everything we've got to hit them all at once." General Teague nodded without hesitation. "Understood. All air units, prepare for immediate assault. Target the command ship and hit it with everything you've got." The final waves of air support, some of the last remaining fighter jets humanity had, began to circle the battlefield. They were all that was left of Earth's aerial forces, scrappy makeshift units that had been assembled in a hurry. But these pilots were the best. They had already lost so much: homes, families, cities, but they had not lost their resolve. The first missiles were launched. They screamed through the sky like the wrath of Earth itself, racing toward the command ship. Marcus held his breath as they hit the massive vessel, explosions rippling across the hull. For a moment it looked like the ship was going to fall. But then, as if mocking their efforts, the ship's defensive systems flared to life again, reinforcing its shields. The invaders were adapting faster than Marcus had ever anticipated. The battle was far from over. But there was a glimmer of hope. He just had to find a way to make it count. The fight raged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Marcus's mind was spinning with possibilities, his body trembling from exhaustion, but he refused to give up. The future of humanity rested in his hands, and he would not let Earth fall without a fight. But even as the alien command ship seemed on the verge of destruction, something more dangerous lurked in the shadows. Something that would make even the invaders' unyielding army seem like a footnote in history. And Marcus had no idea what was coming next. The sky above had become a battlefield. The massive alien ships, their forms dark and ominous, swarmed the atmosphere like a storm of death. Earth's resistance was stretched thin, battered and bruised, but still fighting with a defiance that could not be extinguished. Marcus stood amidst the chaos, his mind racing for any semblance of a plan that could turn the tide. They had fought valiantly, and for a fleeting moment it looked like victory might be within their grasp. But the enemy's adaptations, their speed in recovery, and their overwhelming numbers threatened to crush humanity's resolve. As the final missile from the last remaining fighter jets slammed into the command ship, a surge of desperation flooded Marcus's veins. The explosions from the airstrike lit up the sky, and for a brief, gut-wrenching moment, it seemed like the invaders might be repelled. But then the truth became painfully clear. The command ship's defensive shields were still holding strong, and the fleet's reinforcements were closing in. It was all coming undone. Marcus's thoughts were sharp and focused as he assessed the dire situation. He had been through so much: his invention, the resistance, the countless hours spent planning and strategizing. But he had never imagined the scale of destruction that was unfolding now. The alien technology was just too advanced, too powerful. They had been able to withstand everything Earth had thrown at them. In the midst of the chaos, Marcus heard General Teague's voice through the comms, heavy with frustration. "We've lost too many. They're too strong. We can't hold them off much longer." But Marcus was done with defeat. He had already lost so much. His town, his family, the entire world had already been pushed to the brink of annihilation. They could not go down like this, not after everything they had fought for. "We don't stop," Marcus replied, his voice sharper than ever. "We give it everything we've got, or we don't walk away." He turned to Doctor Moore, who was still hunched over the control panel, her eyes flickering with concern. "Helena, how long until the secondary cannons are recharged?" Helena wiped the sweat from her brow, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We can hit them again. Maybe one more shot, but the power supply is almost depleted. After that, we'll be out of options." Marcus's gaze shifted to the distant horizon, where the rift in the sky seemed to pulse with an unearthly light. The invaders were close. They were coming. And this time, they weren't holding back. "No," Marcus muttered, thinking aloud. His fingers danced across the control panel, trying to make sense of the dwindling options before him. The electromagnetic pulses had worked before, but the enemy was adapting too fast. But maybe, just maybe, the only way to win was to throw everything they had left at the enemy, to make them feel the full force of humanity's wrath. "Helena," Marcus said, his mind racing. "We need to overload the power core, make it unstable. We'll have one final shot. It'll be all or nothing. If we hit that command ship and it goes down, the rest of the fleet will falter. If we miss—" He didn't finish the sentence. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. Helena's face paled as she glanced at him, understanding what he was suggesting. "That's suicide," she said, her voice trembling. "The entire base will go with it. We'll all die." Marcus didn't flinch. "We don't have a choice. We're out of time. We're out of options." General Teague's voice crackled through the comms again. Marcus, what are you thinking? Don't do this. We can still fight back. There's still time. Marcus's voice was cold, resolute. The only thing that's left is to make them pay for what they've done. All of it. The cities, the lives, everything. If we don't stop them now, humanity's finished. It's either us or them. Helena looked at him, her eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. But beneath that was the flicker of understanding. She knew what this meant. All right, we'll do it your way. But we need to move fast. If we don't trigger the overload at the right moment, we'll lose everything. Then make sure we don't, Marcus said, turning back to the control panel. I'll keep the heat on the command ship. You handle the power core. We do this together.